There are places in this country where winter doesn't arrive. It descends. It drops onto a town like a hammer onto an anvil, and everything underneath just has to hold. Braidwood, Illinois was one of those places. A small town about 60 miles south of Chicago population, just over 24,000, the kind of place where the grain elevator was the tallest thing on the skyline, and the only traffic jam happened when a combine rolled across the two-lane highway during harvest season. It was a town that used to make things: steel, auto parts, packaging materials. The factories had given it a pulse for decades, but one by one they closed down or moved south, and what they left behind was a town still standing but barely breathing. January 7th, a Tuesday. The National Weather Service had issued a wind chill advisory that morning. Temperatures had dropped to 5 degrees below zero, and the wind coming off the flats made it feel like 20 below. The kind of cold that doesn't just make you uncomfortable. It attacks you. It finds every gap in your clothing, every inch of exposed skin, and it goes to work on you like it has a personal grudge. Your fingers go numb in under a minute. Your lungs burn if you breathe in too fast. Your eyes water and the tears freeze on your cheeks before they make it halfway down. Main Street in Braidwood ran straight through the center of town. 6 blocks of low brick buildings with awnings that hadn't been replaced since the 80s. A hardware store, a barbershop with a spinning pole that still worked, a diner on the corner called Lorraine's that had been serving eggs and coffee for 31 years, a bar across the street with no sign out front because everybody already knew what it was. On a normal day, Main Street had foot traffic, people running errands, kids walking home from school, old-timers sitting on the bench outside the post office arguing about the weather or the Bears, or whoever was running the county into the ground that month. But this was not a normal day. The cold had emptied the street. Most of the shops had closed early. The hardware store was dark. The barbershop had a handwritten note in the window that said, "Back tomorrow." Lorraine's had shut down around 2 in the afternoon because the pipes in the back kitchen were threatening to freeze, and Lorraine herself had been on her feet since 5 in the morning. The closed sign hung in the front window, and the lights were off except for one fluorescent tube in the back that she always left on out of habit. The only sounds on Main Street at 4 o'clock that afternoon were the wind scraping across the pavement and the low rumbling idle of 5 motorcycles parked in a row outside the bar. Big machines, Harley-Davidsons, every one of them. Chrome pipes, wide handlebars, leather saddlebags cracked from years of road dust and rain. The men sitting on them matched the bikes. Large, weathered, leather cuts with patches sewn across the back. Tattoos that climbed up forearms and disappeared under collars. The kind of men that made people check their door locks at a stoplight. The kind of men that mothers pulled their children away from in a parking lot without even realizing they were doing it. They were waiting on a 5th member of their group who was inside the bar settling a tab. Engine exhaust rose in white clouds and vanished in the wind. None of them were talking. They just sat there, hands in their pockets, or wrapped around their grips, enduring the cold the way men like them endured most things. Silently and without complaint. The biggest of the group sat at the end of the row. His bike was the loudest. His frame was the widest. 6'4", 260 pounds, most of it across his shoulders and chest, shaved head, a scar that started just below his left ear and ran all the way down to his collarbone, a pale ridge of tissue that stood out against the red of his cold-flushed skin. His name was Garrett. He'd been riding with the club for 11 years. He was their sergeant-at-arms, which is the position that handles problems when they come up, physical problems. Garrett was built for the job in every way that mattered, and in a few ways that didn't bear talking about in polite company. He had a record: assault, disorderly conduct, a weapons charge that got pleaded down. He'd spent 14 months in county when he was 23 and another 8 months in state at 29. He wasn't a man anyone in Braidwood would have described as kind. He wasn't a man anyone would have crossed the street to shake hands with. He was the man they crossed the street to avoid. That's important. Remember that. Because what happened next only matters if you understand who it happened to. At 4:07 in the afternoon, a small figure appeared at the far end of Main Street, moving slowly, unsteadily, the way someone moves when their body is running on nothing and their legs are just doing what legs do out of habit, not because there's any fuel left to power them. The figure was small because it was a child, a girl, 6 years old. Her name was Sophie. She wore a purple jacket 2 sizes too big. The zipper was broken and the jacket hung open, flapping in the wind like a flag on a pole that nobody saluted anymore. No gloves, no hat, thin canvas tennis shoes with no socks. Her ankles were bare and the skin above her shoes was red, almost raw from the cold. She walked with her arms wrapped around herself, clutching the front of that jacket closed with fingers that had stopped feeling anything a long time ago. She made it about halfway down the block before her legs gave out. Her knees hit the pavement first, then her palms. The concrete was so cold it burned. She stayed there for a moment on all fours, her breath coming in short visible bursts that the wind tore apart the second they left her mouth. Then she sat back on her heels and looked up at the sky. Her face was thin. Her cheekbones stood out too sharply for a child her age. Her lips were cracked and gray. Her eyes were red but dry. She'd run out of tears a long time ago. Crying takes calories, and calories were something Sophie hadn't had in 2 days. She opened her mouth and said 2 words. Not loud, not screaming, just a small broken voice pushed out by a body that had spent its last reserves on the effort. I'm starving. 2 words. That was all. 2 words on a frozen sidewalk in a town that was supposed to take care of its own. A woman in a gray wool coat was walking toward her from the direction of the post office. Mid-50s, glasses, a paper grocery bag in the crook of her arm. She saw Sophie on the ground. Their eyes met. The woman's pace changed, not slower, faster. She tucked her chin into her collar and picked up her stride and walked right past the girl without breaking step. She didn't look back. She didn't slow down. She was inside her car and pulling away from the curb within 30 seconds. A man came out of the hardware store's side entrance. 60s, work boots, flannel shirt under a Carhartt jacket. He had a bag of road salt in one hand and his keys in the other. He saw Sophie sitting on the concrete. He looked at her for a full 3 seconds. Then he looked up at the sky as if he were checking the weather, which he already knew because he'd been complaining about it all day. He walked to his pickup truck, loaded the salt into the bed, got behind the wheel, and drove away. He passed within 8 feet of her and never said a word. A young couple appeared from the cross street, late 20s, matching scarves. They saw Sophie from about 40 feet away. The woman said something to the man. The man glanced over. They crossed to the other side of the street. Didn't hurry exactly, but didn't linger either. They walked the rest of the block on the opposite sidewalk and turned the corner without looking back. An elderly woman pushing a wire shopping cart came within 10 feet of Sophie. She slowed. She looked. Something crossed her face that might have been concern or might have been calculation. She adjusted the scarf over her mouth and pushed her cart forward. The wheels squeaked against the concrete as she passed, and the sound hung in the cold air for a moment before the wind carried it away. 4 people, 4 adults in the span of about 90 seconds. Every single one of them saw a 6-year-old child sitting alone on a frozen sidewalk in 5 below weather, with no gloves and no hat and a jacket that couldn't keep out a spring breeze. Every single one of them made a decision, and every single one of them decided it wasn't their problem. Here's the thing about that decision. It wasn't made out of cruelty. None of those people went home that night and laughed about the girl they'd ignored. They went home and made dinner. They turned on the heat. They sat in warm living rooms and watched the evening news. They were decent people. They paid their taxes. They waved to their neighbors. They donated to the food drive at church every Thanksgiving. They were good people by every measure that this country uses to define goodness. but good people who keep walking when a child is starving on a frozen sidewalk. That was the math of Main Street on January 7th, and the total didn't add up to anything that could save Sophie's life. Across the street, Garrett turned his head. He didn't hear her words exactly. The wind was too strong and the distance too far for that. But he heard something, a sound that cut through the engine noise and the wind and the general deadness of the afternoon. A human voice, small, broken, the kind of sound that doesn't carry because of volume but because of need. He looked. He saw the girl on the ground. He saw the purple jacket. He saw the bare ankles. He saw her sitting there with her arms wrapped around herself, rocking slightly, the way a body does when it's trying to generate heat that it doesn't have the fuel to produce. He watched for about 10 seconds. His face didn't change. No flash of emotion, no furrowed brow. He just observed the way a man observes a situation before he decides how to enter it. One of his brothers, a man named Boone, short and stocky, with a gray beard that hung to the middle of his chest, saw Garrett looking and followed his gaze. "Where you going?" he said as Garrett kicked the stand down on his Harley and swung one leg off. The bike rocked from the weight leaving it. Garrett didn't answer. He didn't look at Boone. He didn't look left or right. He stepped off the curb and walked straight across Main Street toward the girl. A pickup truck was coming from the south end of the block, moving slowly because of the ice, but still moving. The driver saw Garrett step into the road and hit the brakes. The truck skidded slightly, and the driver leaned on the horn. The sound was enormous in the empty street, a long, angry blast that echoed off every building on the block. Garrett didn't flinch, didn't turn his head, didn't raise a hand or alter his path by a single degree. He just kept walking, steady, deliberate, and like the truck was invisible. Like the only thing that existed in the world at that moment was the girl on the other side of the street. He stopped about 5 feet from her. He didn't crouch down, didn't bend at the waist, didn't try to make himself smaller or less intimidating. He just stood there. This massive figure in black leather, steam rising off his shoulders in the cold, looking down at a child who weighed maybe 40 pounds. "Hey," he said. His voice was low, rough. The kind of voice that sounds like it was built for giving orders in loud rooms and for making people listen whether they wanted to or not. But right now, in this moment, it was quiet, not soft exactly. Garrett didn't do soft, but controlled, measured, the way a man speaks when he knows his voice alone can scare a child and he's being careful not to. "When's the last time you ate?" Sophie looked up at him. Her eyes moved slowly the way eyes move when the brain behind them is running on fumes. She took in his teen, his leather, his tattoos, his scar. None of it registered as fear. She was too far past fear. Fear requires energy, and she had none left to spend on it. She held up 2 fingers. 2 hours, Garrett asked. She shook her head. 2 days, she nodded, once. A small, tired dip of the chin. Garrett's jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes, but it came and went so fast that if you blinked, you would have missed it entirely. He turned around and looked at Lorraine's diner. Dark windows, closed sign hanging on the front door. He walked to that door in 4 long strides and grabbed the handle. Locked, he knocked. Not the way you knock on a friend's door, not the polite double tap that says, "I'm here if you're free." He knocked the way a man knocks when he has decided that the door is going to open, and the only question is whether the person inside opens it willingly or not. 3 heavy blows that rattled the glass in the frame and sent the closed sign swinging on its hook. Nothing happened. The diner stayed dark. He knocked again. Harder. The glass shook so violently that the neon sign in the window flickered from the vibration. A light came on in the back. The fluorescent tube that Lorraine always left on was joined by a second, and then a figure moved through the darkness of the dining room toward the front. A woman's face appeared behind the glass of the door. Lorraine herself, 62 years old, short gray hair that she cut herself every 6 weeks. Strong hands, tired eyes set in a face that had been getting up before dawn to feed this town for 3 decades. She saw Garrett standing on her doorstep, and her whole expression tightened. Her lips pressed together, her chin lifted slightly. She shook her head and pointed at the closed sign with one deliberate finger, as if she were explaining something to someone who might not be able to read. Garrett didn't move. He didn't knock again. He didn't try to argue through the glass. He just raised one hand and pointed over his shoulder, behind him, at Sophie, still sitting on the cold concrete, this tiny figure in a purple jacket alone on the empty sidewalk. Lorraine's eyes shifted. They moved from Garrett's face to the space behind him, and when they found Sophie, something changed. It started in her eyes and moved down through her face like a crack spreading through ice. The tightness in her jaw softened. Her hand, which had been flat against the glass in a gesture of refusal, curled into a loose fist and dropped to her side. Garrett leaned close to the glass. His breath fogged the window between them. He said something. Quiet. Just for her. Nobody on the street could have heard it. The words existed only in the 3 inches of cold air between his mouth and the glass. Whatever he said, it worked. Lorraine looked past him at the girl one more time, looked back at his face, then she reached down and turned the deadbolt. The lock clicked. She pulled the door open, not wide, just enough for a man his size to fit through. She stepped back and let him in. Garrett turned around and walked back to Sophie. He didn't say anything. He just bent down and picked her up. Not gently the way you handle something fragile, not roughly the way you handle something that doesn't matter. Something in between. The way you lift a body that needs to be somewhere warm right now, and you're the only mechanism available to make that happen. He cradled her against his chest. She weighed nothing. 40 pounds of cold skin and hollow bones pressed against 260 pounds of leather and muscle. Her head fell against his shoulder and stayed there. He carried her inside and set her down in a booth by the front window. The vinyl seat was cold, but the wind was gone. That alone was something. The absence of wind in January can feel like a gift when you've been sitting in it long enough. Lorraine was already behind the counter. She hadn't said a word to Garrett, hadn't asked who the girl was or why she was out there or whose child she was. She just started working, flipped the switch on the grill, pulled a pan from the rack. Cracked eggs, dropped butter into a skillet. The sound of cooking filled the diner the way only that sound can, a sizzle and a pop and a warmth that starts in your ears before it reaches your skin. Within 5 minutes, Boone walked through the front door. Behind him came Colt, a lean man with full-sleeve tattoos on both arms and a voice that didn't match anything about his appearance. It was soft, almost gentle, the kind of voice you'd expect from a librarian, not from a man who rode a Harley through January nights without a windshield. Behind Colt came 2 more. Stump, who got his name from the obvious reason, and a quiet man everybody called Preacher, though he'd never been inside a church in his life. Nobody told him to come in. They'd watched Garrett carry the girl through the door, and that was enough. They filed into the booth directly behind Sophie, backs to the wall, facing the entrance. 4 men in leather arranged around a sleeping child the way centuries arrange themselves around something they've been ordered to protect. It wasn't discussed. It wasn't planned. It was just what they did. Colt stood up from the booth, unzipped his leather jacket, and draped it over Sophie's shoulders. The jacket weighed at least 15 pounds. It swallowed her completely. Only her face was visible above the collar, and her thin fingers poked out from under the hem. But the second that jacket settled onto her, Sophie's hands came up and grabbed the edges and pulled them tight around herself. She clutched that leather like it was the most valuable thing anyone had ever given her. Lorraine set a plate down in front of the girl. Scrambled eggs, 2 slices of toast with butter melting into the bread, 4 strips of bacon, a tall glass of milk. The plate was heavy ceramic, the kind that holds heat, and steam rose off the eggs in thin curls. Sophie didn't reach for the fork. She grabbed a strip of bacon with both hands and bit into it so hard and so fast that she started coughing. Her body wasn't ready for food. 2 days without eating had shrunk her stomach and dulled her reflexes. The bacon went down the wrong way. and she coughed hard, her small frame shaking under the weight of that massive jacket. Garrett reached across the table and put his hand on her arm. His hand covered her entire forearm from wrist to elbow. "Slow," he said. That one word, low, steady, not a command exactly, but not a suggestion either. Something in between that only certain voices can pull off. "It's not going anywhere. Take your time." Sophie looked up at him. Something moved behind her eyes. Not gratitude exactly, something deeper and more desperate. The recognition that someone was paying attention, that someone was watching and had decided to stay. She slowed down, just barely. But she slowed. She ate everything on that plate, every piece of egg, both slices of toast, all 4 strips of bacon. She drank the milk in 3 long swallows without taking the glass from her lips. Lorraine came back with a bowl of chicken soup. Sophie ate that too. Then a warm dinner roll. She tore it apart with her fingers and pushed every crumb into her mouth. She scraped the bowl with the back of her spoon. Then she leaned back in the booth. Colt's jacket still wrapped around her like a cocoon. The warmth of the diner and the weight of the food hit her system at the same time, and her body did what anybody would do when it's been running on empty for 48 hours and finally gets what it needs. It shut down. Her eyes closed, her breathing slowed, her fingers still gripping the collar of the jacket, relaxed one by one until her hands lay still in her lap. She was asleep in under a minute. Her body had been running a marathon for 48 hours straight, and it had just crossed the finish line and collapsed. Lorraine came around the counter and stood at the end of the booth. She looked at Sophie for a long time. Then she looked at Garrett, and when she spoke, her voice had a shake in it that hadn't been there before. "How long was she out there?" Garrett shook his head. "Don't know. Long enough." Lorraine pressed the dish rag against her mouth. Her eyes were wet, but she was not going to let them spill. Not here. Not in front of these men. She had been running this diner for 31 years, and she had seen hard times walk through that door in every shape they came in. Farmers who lost everything to a bad season. Factory workers who picked up their last paycheck on a Friday and couldn't look their wives in the eye by Monday. Old men who sat at the counter nursing 1 cup of coffee for 3 hours because the diner was the only warm place they had left. She had seen all of it, but she had never seen a 6-year-old walk in from 5 below cold with no socks on her feet and a belly that had been empty for 2 days. That was new. That cut somewhere she didn't know she could still be cut. She went back behind the counter and started washing dishes that didn't need washing because she needed her hands to be doing something other than shaking. Outside, the wind picked up. It hit the front window with a low moan that rattled the glass in its frame. The neon sign that spelled Lorraine's in faded pink script flickered twice and held. Through the window, Main Street was a dead thing. No cars, no pedestrians, just the dark coming down on top of the cold and pressing the whole town flat. Boone sat with his arms crossed over his chest. He was the oldest of the group, 57. He had been riding longer than some of the younger members had been alive. His beard was more gray than brown now, and his hands had a permanent ache in them from 3 decades of gripping handlebars in weather that no reasonable person would ride in. But he was here. He was always here. Boone didn't talk about loyalty. He didn't wear it on a patch or put it in a speech. He just showed up every time, without fail. That was his whole philosophy, and it fit in 4 words. Colt sat against the wall, his jacket gone, his tattooed arms folded across his thin chest. Without the leather, he looked younger, narrower. The tattoos ran from his wrists to his shoulders, a history written in ink, names of people who mattered to him, some still living, some not. He watched Sophie sleep the way a man watches a small fire in the dark, steadily, without blinking, as if the act of watching was itself a form of protection. Stump had his elbows on the table and his chin on his fists. He had not spoken a word since they walked through the door. Stump rarely spoke. His contribution to any situation was his physical presence, which was substantial, and his willingness to act without being asked twice. He looked at Sophie's sleeping face and something shifted behind his eyes. Something that had no name and that he would not have been able to explain if someone had held a gun to his head and demanded an answer. He looked away. Preacher sat with his eyes closed and his lips moving slightly. Anyone who didn't know him might have thought he was praying. He wasn't. He was doing what he always did in quiet moments. Counting, seconds, breaths. It was a habit he had developed during a long stretch in a place where counting was the only thing that kept the walls from closing in. These men were not performing. There were no cameras. Nobody was live streaming. Nobody was going to post this anywhere or turn it into content or put it on a screen with a sad piano track behind it. The diner was closed. The street was empty. The only audience was Lorraine and the coffee machine and the clock on the wall that ticked louder than it had any right to in the silence. This was not charity. This was not outreach. It was 5 men in a closed diner watching a child sleep after her first real meal in 2 days, and not one of them had said a single unnecessary word about it. They just sat, drank coffee, watched the door, like they were standing guard over something that mattered and would keep standing guard until someone told them it was safe to stop. Nobody was going to tell them that tonight. The diner went quiet, not the uncomfortable silence of people who don't know what to say. The settled silence of a room where something important has just happened and the room itself is still absorbing it. Lorraine wiped down the counter with a dish rag that had been wrung 1,000 times. The grill clicked as it cooled. The bikers sat in their booth with their coffee. Boone had his elbows on the table. Colt was watching the front door. Stump was looking at the floor. Preacher had his eyes closed, but he wasn't sleeping. He was listening. Garrett sat across from Sophie. He watched her breathe. The rise and fall of that small chest under the heavy leather. The flicker of her eyelids as she dropped into deeper sleep. The way her mouth had relaxed from that tight, cracked line into something that almost looked peaceful. He looked at Lorraine. She walked here by herself, he said, in this cold, at 6 years old. Somebody tell me how that happens. Lorraine wrung the dish rag in her hands. She looked at the girl and then back at Garrett. I've seen her before. She comes around sometimes. Hangs near the door when we're open. I've given her rolls a few times. Her mama lives over on Ash Street. Ash Street, Garrett repeated. He knew the name. Everybody in Braidwood knew it. Ash Street was 6 blocks south and 2 blocks east on the other side of the railroad tracks that split the town into the part people talked about and the part they didn't. The houses on Ash Street had peeling paint and sagging porches and chain-link fences with weeds growing through them in summer and ice locking them in winter. The street lights had been out for months because nobody from the city ever came to fix them. It was the street you drove past on the way to somewhere else and tried not to look at too closely. Garrett looked back at Sophie. She was out cold. Her breathing was slow and steady. That tiny body curled into a ball inside a biker's jacket in a booth that smelled like bacon grease and coffee. For a long moment, everything in the diner felt settled, resolved. The girl was fed. She was warm. She was safe. It felt like the end of something. A child was hungry and someone helped her. That was the whole story. Lorraine poured one more round of coffee. The bikers stretched in their seats. The clock on the wall behind the counter showed 4:42. The afternoon was fading into evening and the temperature outside was still dropping. Then Boone leaned forward across the table. His voice was low, careful. The way you speak when you're about to change the shape of a conversation and you know it. Garrett looked at him. That jacket she came in with, the purple one, pick it up. Garrett reached across the booth. Sophie's purple jacket had slipped off the seat and lay crumpled against the wall. He picked it up and held it out. The zipper was broken. The fabric was worn through at both elbows. The left sleeve had a tear along the shoulder seam that had been closed with a safety pin that had since come undone. It was the kind of jacket you find in a donation bin at the end of winter when everything good has already been taken. The kind of jacket that keeps nothing out and holds nothing in. But Boone wasn't pointing at the jacket itself. He was pointing at the inside, the lining. It was torn open along the bottom seam and something was stuffed inside. Crumpled pieces of paper folded and pressed flat between the lining and the outer shell. Garrett pulled them out one by one. His big hands worked carefully with the deliberate precision of someone who understands that what he's holding might be important even though it looks like trash. The first was a utility shut-off notice, dated 3 weeks earlier. The header said Braidwood Municipal Power. The body said service had been terminated for non-payment. The amount owed was $147.63. The second was a past due rent slip, red ink stamped across it in block letters. Final notice. The landlord's name was printed at the top. The amount was $800. The due date had passed 6 weeks ago. The third was a receipt from a gas station. 1 bottle of water, 1 pack of cheese crackers. Total $3.19. Paid in cash. The date was 5 days ago. Garrett laid each piece of paper on the table in a row. 3 documents. 3 pieces of a story that was writing itself in front of him, whether he wanted to read it or not. Then he reached into the lining one more time. His fingers found one more piece of paper, smaller than the others, folded into a tight square. He unfolded it carefully. Lined paper, the kind that comes in a school notebook. And on it, written in large and even letters in pencil, the handwriting of a child who was just learning to form words on a page, was a note. It said, "Please help us. Mama won't wake up." 6 words. 6 words in pencil on lined paper. Each letter pressed so hard into the page that the pencil had torn through in 2 places. The P in please was oversized, nearly twice as tall as the other letters, the way a child writes when she is pressing down with everything her small hand can muster, because she believes at some instinctive level that pressing harder will make the words matter more. The M in mama was smudged where a thumb had dragged across it. The W in wake was written over twice, as if she had second-guessed the letter and then committed to it with a darker, heavier stroke. The handwriting slanted to the right and dipped toward the bottom of the page the way a child's writing does when her hand is tired and the desk is too high and there is no one sitting beside her to help steady the pencil. Garrett read those words. He read them once, read them again. Then one more time because some part of his brain was still trying to reject what his eyes were delivering. His jaw went tight. The muscles in his neck stood out like cables pulled taut. He didn't breathe for a full 5 seconds. When the air finally came back into him, it came slow and controlled, forced through a body that was working very hard to keep something inside itself from breaking loose. He set the note down on the table beside the other papers. A shut-off notice, a rent slip, a gas station receipt, and a child's plea written in pencil on school paper. 4 documents in a row on a diner table under a fluorescent light. Together they told a story so simple and so devastating that it could have been reduced to a single sentence. A family was falling apart, and nobody had noticed until a 6-year-old girl decided to carry the evidence herself. Garrett placed the jacket over the papers carefully, gently, because he understood that what lay underneath it was the most important thing he had held in a very long time. He looked at Boone. Boone looked back. Something passed between them that did not require words. 11 years of writing together. 11 years of reading each other across dark rooms and loud bars and roadside breakdowns and the kind of situations where there is no time for discussion and no room for hesitation. They understood each other the way 2 men understand each other when they have bled in the same places and buried the same friends and sat through the same long nights waiting for mornings that took their time arriving. This was not a hungry child who had missed a couple of meals because the grocery run slipped someone's mind. This was something far worse and far older. This was a 6-year-old girl who had been carrying the proof of her family's collapse inside the lining of her jacket pressed flat against her own ribs for days, maybe weeks. She had stuffed those papers into the torn seam the way a soldier stuffs identification tags into a pocket before walking into a place he might not walk out of. Because Sophie understood at a depth that no child her age should ever have to reach, that those papers were evidence. Proof that if she could just find one person willing to look at them, one person willing to read the words and understand what they meant, maybe that person would come. She had tried. Garrett could see that without being told. The evidence was in the papers themselves. The utility notice had fingerprints on it, small ones, a child's. The corners were bent and soft from being folded and unfolded and presented to adults who had looked at them with blank faces or had waved them away or had simply refused to take them. The rent slip was the same way, worn at the creases, handled so many times that the red ink of the stamped letters had started to fade. The note itself had been written more than once. Garrett could see the eraser marks beneath the pencil lines, the places where letters had been rubbed out and rewritten, where words had been rearranged and tried again, the patient work of a child who was pouring every ounce of her limited literacy into getting the message right. Because she knew the words had to be clear. They had to be legible. A stranger had to be able to read them and understand in a single glance what was happening inside that house on Ash Street. She had carried those papers into the cold. She had walked through this town on feet that had no socks, in shoes that had no insulation, and she had knocked on doors and stood in front of counters and held those papers up to the faces of adults who were supposed to know better. The woman at the convenience store who said she would call someone, nobody came. The school locked for winter break. The neighbor who never answered his door. One by one, every avenue a 6-year-old could think of had been tried, and every single one had closed in front of her like a door swinging shut. And still she had walked out again today, in 5 below, alone, with those papers stuffed against her chest. Because giving up was not something Sophie understood yet. She was 6. 6-year-olds don't know how to stop trying. They haven't learned that yet. The world hasn't beaten that particular lesson into them. So she had kept going and going and going until her body finally went down on a frozen sidewalk, and those 2 words came out of her mouth like the last 2 bullets in a chamber. The note was still on the table. 6 words. The whole world compressed into 6 words. Garrett stood up from the booth. The vinyl seat exhaled as his weight left it. He looked at Colt. Stay with the girl. Nobody moves her. Nobody touches her. She doesn't leave this booth. Colt nodded once. His soft voice said, she's not going anywhere. Garrett looked at Lorraine. His voice was flat, level. The voice of a man who has already decided what he's going to do and is now just collecting the information he needs to do it. Ash Street, how far? Lorraine set the coffee pot down. 8 blocks south, turn left on Vine, small white house, chain link fence. You can't miss it. Garrett was through the door before she finished the last word. Boone and Stump and Preacher were right behind him. 4 men in leather walking across Main Street in the falling darkness, their breath rising in white columns, their boots heavy on the frozen ground. 4 Harley-Davidsons fired up at the same time. The roar of those engines was enormous. It bounced off the brick buildings and rolled down the empty street and filled the air with a sound that was pure force, pure intention, pure forward motion. The headlights cut through the early dark like searchlights sweeping a field. They pulled out in a line. Garrett first, then Boone, then Stump, then Preacher. Single file, tight formation. The way they always rode when they were moving with purpose towards something that mattered. They turned south on Main Street and the headlights cut through the falling dark like white blades slicing a black curtain. The town changed as they rode. The brick storefronts gave way to residential streets with bare trees lining the curbs. The residential streets gave way to smaller houses set closer together with cars in the driveways that hadn't been washed since fall. Then the railroad tracks, 2 sets of rusted steel rails embedded in cracked asphalt, the crossing signal flashing yellow in the cold for a train that wasn't coming. They crossed the tracks and the world shifted. The houses got smaller. The lots got narrower. The fences went from wooden to chain link. The porch lights, the ones that still worked, gave off a thin yellow glow that barely reached the sidewalk. This was the other side of Braidwood, the side that didn't show up in the Chamber of Commerce brochure, the side that the mayor didn't mention when he gave his State of the Town address every April. These were the streets where the paychecks ran out before the month did, and where the furnace breaking down in January was not an inconvenience, but a crisis. Where a lost job didn't mean tightening your belt. It meant choosing between the electric bill and groceries and hoping the choice you made didn't kill someone before the next check came. Ash Street was the worst of it. 6 blocks of houses that had been built in the 1950s for factory workers and their families and had been slowly deteriorating ever since. The factories were gone now. The workers had either left town or stayed and slipped into the kind of poverty that doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates. One missed payment at a time. One broken appliance at a time. One unreturned phone call at a time. Until one day you look around and everything that held your life together has quietly come apart, and there's nobody standing nearby who noticed it happening. The streetlights on Ash Street had been out for months, 3 of them in a row. Burned bulbs that the city had been notified about in September and still hadn't replaced because Ash Street was at the bottom of every priority list this town had ever written. The only light came from a single working lamp halfway down the block that cast a pale cone of illumination onto the cracked sidewalk beneath it. Garrett saw the house before he reached it, third from the end on the south side. Small, white. Or it had been white once. Now the paint was peeling in long strips that curled away from the siding like dead skin lifting off a wound. A chain link fence ran along the front of the property, but half of it had fallen over, and the gate hung open on one hinge, swaying slightly in the wind, with a creak that sounded like a question nobody was going to answer. The front yard was mostly frozen dirt. A few dead weeds poked up through a thin crust of ice. No lawn, no garden, nothing growing. A single window faced the street. A diagonal crack ran across the glass from one corner to the other, sealed with a strip of masking tape that had turned brown and brittle long ago. He pulled up to the curb and killed the engine. The other 3 did the same. The silence that followed was enormous. After 4 Harleys running full open, the quiet was almost violent. It pressed against the ears. It filled the street. It settled over everything like a weight. Garrett swung off the bike. His boots hit the frozen ground. He stood there for a moment looking at the house, and he knew before he took his first step toward the porch that something was very wrong. He had been inside enough bad situations in his life to recognize the feel of one from a distance. There was something in the air around that house. Not a smell exactly, though that would come later. Something else. An absence. The absence of life. The absence of sound. The absence of any indication that anyone inside was doing anything at all. Boone came up beside him. Stump and Preacher flanked them. 4 men standing on a frozen sidewalk, looking at a small white house that was radiating wrongness from every surface. The front door was open. Not cracked, not ajar, wide open. Standing all the way back on its hinges as if someone had thrown it open hours ago and never come back to close it. In 5 below weather, the front door of this house was gaping wide and the darkness inside was total and complete. Cold air was pouring out of that doorway the same way cold air was pouring into it, because there was no difference anymore between the inside of that house and the January night outside it. Garrett walked up the porch steps. They sagged and groaned under his weight. The wood was soft in places where water had gotten in and the rot had started its slow, patient work. He crossed the porch in 2 strides and stopped at the threshold. The darkness beyond the doorway was thick and complete. No lights, no glow from an appliance, nothing. He could feel the cold coming from inside the house the same way he could feel it behind him. There was no boundary anymore. The house and the night were the same temperature, the same emptiness, the same silence. He stepped inside. The hallway was narrow. The floor was bare wood, warped in places, and it creaked under every step. He could see his own breath in the air in front of him. The only light came from the single working street lamp halfway down the block. It reached through the front window at an angle and laid a pale stripe across the living room floor. The living room had almost nothing in it. A couch with the cushions caved in and the fabric torn at one arm. A folding table pushed against the wall with one leg propped up on a phone book because the bracket had broken and nobody had the money or the tools or the energy to fix it. No television, no pictures on the walls, no bookshelf, no lamp, no toys, nothing that said a child lived here, nothing that said anyone lived here, except for a single coloring book on the floor near the couch. Most of the pages had been torn out. The ones that remained were colored in with a single crayon purple pressed so hard into the paper that the wax had built up in thick ridges along the lines. Sophie's coloring book, Sophie's purple crayon, the only evidence in that room that a 6-year-old girl called this place home. The kitchen was worse. The counters were bare, not a can, not a box of cereal, not a bag of bread, not a single crumb of anything edible. The cabinets hung open and every shelf was empty. The refrigerator stood in the corner unplugged, the cord coiled on the floor like a dead snake. Garrett opened it anyway. The door swung wide on stiff hinges, and inside there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not a bottle of ketchup, not a jar of mustard, not a container of leftovers, or a stick of butter, or a single egg. The shelves were bare white plastic, and the light didn't come on because there was no power running to this house and hadn't been for 3 weeks. Garrett closed the refrigerator door. The sound of it shutting echoed through the empty kitchen and down the hallway like a door closing inside a church. It was the loudest thing in the house, the only thing. Then he heard something from the back of the house, faint, thin, a sound so weak it barely qualified as sound at all. A moan, or something trying to be a moan. The kind of noise a human being makes when they are too exhausted to form words but too alive to be silent. It came through the walls like a whisper through stone. Garrett turned toward the hallway. Behind him, Boone stood in the front doorway, blocking the entrance. Stump was on the porch. Preacher was at the base of the steps, eyes on the street. They had taken their positions without a word the way they always did, and they would hold those positions until Garrett told them otherwise. He walked down the hallway toward the sound. Each step brought him deeper into the cold and the dark and whatever was waiting at the end of that narrow corridor. There were 2 doors, one on the left halfway down, one at the far end, both closed. He reached for the first door and pushed it open. The door swung inward and the hinges screamed. A high metal sound that cut through the silence like a blade. The room beyond was a bedroom. Or it had been once. Now it was barely that. A bare mattress lay on the floor in the center of the room. No bed frame, no box spring. Just a mattress sitting directly on warped hardwood, stained in places and sagging in the middle where a body had lain in the same position for too long. A single thin blanket was pulled up over a figure that lay beneath it, and the blanket rose and fell in shallow, irregular movements that were just barely visible in the dim light. Garrett stepped into the room. The floor groaned. The cold was absolute. There was no difference between the air in this room and the air outside. The walls might as well not have existed. He could see his breath, and in the faint light that filtered through a window with a cracked shade, he could see the breath of the person on the mattress too. 2 thin clouds meeting in the dark. She was on her back. Sophie's mother, Jolene, 31 years old, but she looked 50. Her face was hollowed. The bones of her cheeks stood out sharply beneath skin that had gone gray. Her eyes were open but unfocused, drifting, staring at a point on the ceiling that held nothing. Her lips were cracked and moving slightly, forming words or trying to, but no sound was coming out. Just the movement, just the effort, like a radio tuned to a station that had gone off the air. She was thin in a way that takes weeks to happen, not the thinness of someone who skips a few meals. The thinness of a body that has begun consuming itself because there is nothing else left to consume. Her arms lay at her sides on top of the blanket, and the bones in her wrists were visible each one distinct, pressing against skin that looked like it might tear if she moved too fast. A plastic cup sat on the floor next to the mattress, bone dry, beside it a prescription bottle, orange, white cap. The label was peeling. Garrett picked it up and turned it in his hands. The bottle was empty, not overdose empty, not the emptiness of someone who had swallowed everything at once. Ran out of refills empty. The label showed a date from 6 weeks ago and the pharmacy's phone number and a name that matched the mailbox he'd passed on the way in. She had needed this medication and it had run out and she had not been able to get more. That was the entire story of how a 31-year-old woman ended up lying on a bare mattress in a freezing house with no food and no power, and 2 children who depended on her for everything. Garrett knelt down. The floorboards screamed under the shift of his weight. He was close to her now, close enough to see the veins in her temples, close enough to smell the stale air that rose off the blanket, close enough to see her eyes track slowly toward the sound of his movement, and then widen when they found his face. She flinched, hard, her whole body contracted. This giant man in black leather, shaved headscar down his neck, tattoos climbing his arms, crouching over her in a dark room in the middle of the night. Every instinct in her body fired at once and told her to move to get away to protect herself. But her arms had nothing in them. Her legs had nothing in them. She couldn't push herself up. She couldn't roll away. She could only lie there and look at him with eyes that were wished and terrified and completely helpless. "Listen to me," Garrett said. His voice was the calmest it had been all day. Lower than usual, slower. The way a man speaks when he understands that the person in front of him is balanced on the edge of something and the wrong word at the wrong volume could push them over. "Your daughter is safe. She's warm. She ate. She's at the diner on Main Street with people I trust. Now I need you to tell me, how long have you been like this?" Jolene's eyes searched his face. Whatever she was looking for, she must have found it because the tension in her body released. Not all at once, in stages, like a fist uncurling one finger at a time. Her lips moved, and this time sound came out. Thin, raspy, each word arriving on its own, separated from the next by a pause that was filled with the effort it took to produce it. 4 days. 4 days. This woman had been lying on this mattress for 4 days, in a house with no heat, no power, no food, no phone, no way to call anyone, no way to get up and walk to the door, no way to do anything except lie there and breathe and hope that someone would come. And the only person who had come, the only person who had noticed was a 6-year-old girl in a broken purple jacket who had walked 8 blocks through the worst cold of the year to find help. Garrett had his phone out before Jolene finished speaking. He dialed 911, gave the address, told the dispatcher what he'd found. A woman, severe dehydration, possible malnutrition, no heat in the house, needed a bus immediately. He gave the information the way a man gives information when he has called this number before and knows that efficiency saves time, and time is something the woman on the mattress might not have much of. Then he called the diner. Colt picked up on the first ring. "The mother is down," Garrett said. "Mattress on the floor, no food, no heat, no power. She hasn't moved in 4 days. She needs a hospital tonight." He paused. A beat of silence that lasted longer than it should have. "Has the girl said anything? Anything about anyone else being in the house?" There was noise on the other end. Colt's voice muffled, talking to someone. Then he came back on the line and his voice had changed. It was tighter, stretched. The softness was gone. "Yeah, she just woke up. Garrett, she says there's a baby." The air left the room, not figuratively. Garrett felt it go, felt the oxygen drain out of his lungs and the walls close in by 1/2 inch, and the cold get colder by a degree that shouldn't have been possible. "What? A baby brother? She says he's still in the house. She says she left him in the back room before she went outside." Garrett turned around. The hallway stretched behind him, dark and narrow and silent. There was one more door at the far end, closed. He had walked past it on the way to Jolene's room, and he had not opened it because he hadn't known there was reason to. Now he knew. He walked down the hallway. His boots hit the floor in slow, heavy beats. Each step felt like it took longer than the one before. The closed door at the end of the hall had a gap at the bottom where a thin line of cold air leaked through, and when Garrett reached it, he could feel the draft against his ankles. He put his hand on the knob. The metal was ice. He turned it and pushed. The hinges screamed the way the other door had screamed, and the sound filled the hallway and rolled through the house and came to rest in every empty room like an echo looking for a place to die. The room was small, smaller than the bedroom, barely big enough for what it held. A crib sat in the far corner, pushed against the wall. Wooden. Old. The bars were scuffed, and one of them was cracked. Inside the crib, wrapped in every piece of soft fabric that a 6-year-old girl's hands could gather, was an infant, maybe 8 months old. A boy. His name was Wyatt, though Garrett didn't know that yet. He would learn it later. What he knew right now, what he could see in the thin light that came through the single window of that small freezing room, was this. Sophie had wrapped her brother in everything she could find. A t-shirt was folded around his torso. A dish towel was tucked around his legs. A pillowcase was draped over his arms. A small fleece blanket, faded blue with a torn edge, was layered on top of everything else and tucked in tight around his body. She had built a cocoon out of whatever soft material she could get her hands on, and she had packed it around him with the fierce, desperate precision of a child who understood that her brother's life depended on staying warm and that she was the only person left to make sure of it. Garrett looked at that crib, and something happened inside him that he would never talk about. Not to Boone, not to Colt, not to anyone. Something that started deep in his chest and moved upward and tightened around his throat and pressed against the backs of his eyes. He did not cry. Men like Garrett did not cry. That was the code. That was the wall he had built around himself over 43 years of hard living, but something behind that wall cracked, just once, just for a second. And in that second, he was not a biker or a sergeant at arms or a man with a record and a scar and a reputation that made people cross the street. He was a human being standing in a freezing room, looking at what a 6-year-old girl had done to save her baby brother's life, and the weight of it was almost more than he could hold. The baby was cold. His skin had a bluish tint, especially around the lips. His fingers poking out from the edge of the dish towel were pale and stiff, but his chest was moving. Rising, falling, slow and shallow, the respiration of a body that was conserving every calorie of energy it had left. He was alive. He was alive because Sophie had used every resource available to her, every scrap of cloth and every ounce of her small intelligence to create a barrier between her brother and the cold that was trying to take him. Garrett reached into the crib and picked the baby up. He held him the way he'd seen other men hold infants, but had never done himself. One hand under the small body, the other cradling the back of the head where the skull was soft and the fine hair was damp with cold sweat. He drew the baby against his chest under his leather cut, pressing the small body against his own skin. Skin to warmth, the oldest method of keeping something alive. Older than fire, older than shelter. Just one body giving its heat to another because that was all there was. The baby didn't cry. He didn't have the energy for it. He just lay there against Garrett's chest with his face turned sideways and his mouth slightly open and his small fingers curled against the leather. He was lighter than anything Garrett had ever held. Lighter than a tool. Lighter than a bottle. Lighter than the guilt that had been sitting on Garrett's shoulders since he was 7 years old, and understood for the first time that the world wasn't set up to catch people when they fell. Garrett stood in that dark hallway and did not move. He counted every second. 1, 2, 3. He held the baby against his chest and breathed slowly and willed the warmth from his own body into the infant's. 4, 5, 6. He could feel the baby's heartbeat. It was fast and faint, a small drum beating behind ribs that were thinner than his fingers. 7, 8. He could feel his own heartbeat, too slow or heavier, pushing blood through a body that weighed 260 pounds, and had survived things that should have killed it. And here it was, in the dark, in the cold, holding something that weighed less than a bag of flour and mattered more than anything it had ever held before. 9, 10, 11 minutes. He counted every one. When the paramedics came through the front door, Garrett was still standing there. The red and blue lights from the ambulance outside strobed through the windows and painted the hallway walls in alternating flashes that made the darkness pulse. 2 EMTs came down the hall, a man and a woman, both young, both carrying equipment. The woman saw Garrett first, and her step faltered for half a second because what she saw, there was a 6'4" man in leather and tattoos standing motionless in a dark hallway, holding an infant against his chest. It took her brain a moment to process the image and another moment to understand what it meant. Garrett looked at her. He's cold. He's been in that room. I don't know how long. His mother's in the bedroom. She hasn't been able to move for 4 days. The woman EMT nodded. She reached for the baby with practiced hands. Garrett didn't release him immediately. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, his arms tightened instead of loosened. An involuntary response. The reflex of a body that had been protecting something and was not yet ready to let it go. Then he exhaled, slowly, and he handed the baby over. He watched the EMT check the infant's vital signs under the harsh light of a handheld flashlight. He watched her wrap the baby in a thermal blanket that crinkled as she folded it around him. He watched her carry him toward the front door. "The ambulance has heat," she said over her shoulder. "He's going to be okay." Garrett said nothing. He stood in the hallway until the front door was clear, until the stretcher carrying Jolene was loaded into the back of the ambulance, until Boone climbed on his bike and followed the ambulance toward the hospital, his headlight cutting a steady line through the darkness behind the flashing red lights. Then Garrett walked back outside. He stood on the porch of that ruined house and looked at the street. Ash Street, 6 blocks of forgotten homes and forgotten people and forgotten children who carried notes in their jacket linings because nobody else was going to carry them. He pulled out his phone. The first call went to a man named Hutch, vice president of the chapter. Garrett told him what he'd found, every detail: the house, the cold, the mother, the baby, the note. He didn't embellish. He didn't soften it. He just laid it out like a mechanic describing what's wrong under the hood. Then he said 5 words: Ash Street, bring what you've got. The second call went to a man named Dillard. Same message, same 5 words. The third went to a man named Wyatt, then Combs, then Fulbright, then Mosley. One by one, Garrett called every active member of his chapter, 22 men total. He reached each of them in their kitchens and their garages and their living rooms, and he told each of them the same thing in the same flat, steady voice. By 7 o'clock that evening, 14 motorcycles were lined up along the curb on Ash Street. The engines had gone quiet, but the street was not. Boots on frozen ground, voices in the dark, the rustle of plastic bags and the clank of canned goods being shifted from hand to hand. 22 bikers had descended on Ash Street like a force of nature that nobody had summoned and nobody could stop. They hauled grocery bags out of saddlebags and truck beds, cases of bottled water, blankets, stacks of diapers bound with plastic wrap, cans of infant formula, space heaters still in their boxes, extension cords coiled in loops. They carried these things up the sagging porch steps of the little white house and through the front door that Garrett had propped open with a cinder block because the latch was broken and nobody had fixed it in months. One of the men was a licensed electrician. His name was Polk, and he wore a leather cut with the same patches as the rest of them, and he had a toolbox on the back of his bike that he brought everywhere because you never knew when it would be needed. He found the electrical panel in the basement, assessed the situation in under 5 minutes, and had the power restored in 45. When the lights came on inside that house for the first time in 3 weeks, the men standing in the hallway stopped what they were doing, just for a second, because seeing the inside of that house under electric light was worse than seeing it in the dark. The dark had hidden things: the stains on the walls, the bare floors, the emptiness of the kitchen. The light showed all of it, and none of it was something you could look at without feeling it in your chest. Another man knew plumbing. He got the frozen pipes thawed with a heat gun he'd grabbed from his garage on the way over. Water ran again, rusty at first, sputtering, then clear. They fixed the front door latch. They stacked food on the kitchen counters until there was no more room, and then they lined bags along the floor. Canned soup, canned vegetables, rice, pasta, bread, peanut butter, boxes of cereal, milk in gallon jugs. They filled that kitchen the way water fills a bathtub, steadily and completely until it overflowed. Garrett stood in the living room and watched his brothers work. He didn't direct them. He didn't need to. These men knew how to operate in a space. They knew how to assess what needed doing and do it without being told. That was the thing about this group that nobody outside of it ever understood. The public saw leather and tattoos and motorcycles and assumed chaos. What existed inside the structure was the opposite. Order, discipline, a chain of command that functioned on instinct. When Garrett said go, they went. When there was a job, they found it and did it. No meetings, no committees, no forms to fill out. Just movement, just work. It was a little after 8 when the first knock came. Not on the door of Sophie's house, on the fence. A tentative tap on the chain link, barely audible over the sound of boots and bags and men working. Garrett turned toward it and saw a woman standing on the sidewalk. Mid-30s, thin coat, arms folded across her chest. She lived in the house next door. He'd seen her porch light on when he arrived, the only other working light on this end of the block. She'd been standing on her porch for the past hour watching the bikers move back and forth carrying supplies in and out of the White House. She'd watched without saying a word. Just watching. Now she was at the fence. "My kids haven't eaten today either," she said. No preamble, no apology, no shame in her voice, though it must have cost her something to say it. She just said it. The way you say something that has been sitting in your mouth for days and finally finds its way out because someone else's crisis gave it permission. Garrett looked at her. "How many? 3? He turned to 2 of his men. Didn't even use names. Just pointed at the woman and then at a stack of grocery bags on the porch. They picked up the bags and followed her to her house without a word. Then the man from across the street came over. Older, 60s, bad hip, same story, different address. His electricity was still on, but his refrigerator had been empty for a week, and his Social Security check didn't come until the 15th. Then a woman from 2 doors down. Then a grandmother from the end of the block who walked with a cane and spoke so quietly that Garrett had to lean down to hear her. Ash Street opened up. That is the only way to describe what happened. It opened up the way a frozen river thaws, slowly at first. A crack, a shift, a trickle. Then all at once, what admission of need had broken the seal, and the rest followed like water through a break in a dam. 1 family became 2, 2 became 4, 4 became 7, 7 families on 1 block, all of them running on empty, all of them surviving in silence, all of them invisible to a town that drove past their street every day and never once slowed down to look. By 9 o'clock that night, Garrett and his crew had carried food and supplies into every house on the block that would open its door. Some of them opened right away. Some took longer. 1 woman stood behind her screen door for 10 full minutes looking at the biker on her porch holding a bag of groceries before she finally pushed the door open and stepped aside without saying a word. She didn't need to say anything. The way she looked at that bag of food said everything that words couldn't. This went on past midnight. Grown men in leather and heavy boots carrying packages of diapers up sagging porch steps, handing cans of soup to an elderly woman who held her door open with 1 hand and covered her mouth with the other because she could not believe what she was seeing. 2 of the bikers drove to the only 24-hour Walmart in the county and came back with a truck bed full of winter coats, children's shoes, and canned goods. They paid cash, split the bill between them without being asked. Someone started a fire in a barrel on the sidewalk around 11. Not for warmth exactly, just because people were standing around and needed something to gather near. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months stood shoulder to shoulder with bikers who still had road dust in their beards. Nobody talked about what it meant. Nobody tried to turn it into a moment. They just stood there in the firelight on that broken sidewalk and watched the sparks rise into the black sky and disappear. An old man on the block 80, if he was a day, grabbed Garrett by the arm as he walked past. His grip was stronger than it should have been. His eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying. He was past crying. He'd been past it for years. "Son, who sent you?" Garrett looked at him. "Nobody sent us." And that was the truth. No charity had organized this. No church had put out a call. No government office had issued a directive. No nonprofit had filed a grant proposal. Just a man who heard a child's voice on a frozen street and decided that walking past was something he could not do. One decision, one refusal to look away, and now an entire block was eating for the first time in days because that one decision had rolled downhill like a boulder and picked up everything in its path. The work continued. A woman 3 houses down had a toddler with an ear infection and no money for the prescription. One of the bikers, a man named Fulbright, who looked like he could break a door in half with his bare hands, pulled out his wallet and peeled off $40 and pressed it into her hand and said, "Get the kid to a clinic in the morning." She looked at the money and then at him, and then she closed her fist around it and held it against her chest like she was holding a prayer. In the house at the end of the block, a grandfather was sitting in the dark with his oxygen tank running on its last cylinder because the supply company wouldn't deliver to an address with an overdue balance. Stump found the invoice on the kitchen table, called the number printed on it, and when the after-hours voice told him to leave a message, he left one that was short and specific and delivered in a tone that suggested the oxygen would be arriving by morning or there would be a conversation that nobody at that company wanted to have. The oxygen arrived at 7:15 the next day. These were the details that nobody would ever put in a newspaper article or a social media post because they were too small and too many and too ordinary to be stories on their own. A bag of diapers on a doorstep. A blanket wrapped around the shoulders of a woman who had been shivering for 3 days. A can of infant formula handed to a young mother who was trying to feed her child with watered-down milk because the formula had run out 4 days ago. Each one was small. Each one was everything. By the time the last biker left Ash Street, it was past 2 in the morning. The fire in the barrel had burned down to embers. The neighbors had gone back inside their houses, but the doors were closed now in a different way than they had been closed before. Before they were closed because there was nothing behind them worth opening them for. Now they were closed because the people inside finally had something to keep warm. Garrett rode back to the diner a little after 1 in the morning, before the last of the work was finished because there was something he needed to do that couldn't wait. The cold had gotten worse. The wind had shifted and now it was coming straight out of the north, the kind of wind that finds you no matter how much leather you put between yourself and it. He parked outside Lorraine's and pushed through the door. Sophie was awake, sitting up in the booth, both hands wrapped around a glass of milk. Colt's jacket was still draped over her shoulders and her feet didn't reach the floor. She looked small in a way that had nothing to do with her size and everything to do with what she had carried today that no child should ever have to carry. She looked up at Garrett when he came through the door and said the words that had been waiting inside her since he left. "Is Mama okay?" Garrett sat down across from her. The booth creaked under him. He folded his hands on the table. His knuckles were cracked and red from the cold, and his fingers were stiff, and there was a cut on his left palm from the chain-link fence that he didn't remember getting. "She's going to the doctor," he said. "They're going to take care of her." "What about Wyatt?" "Wyatt's going too. He's all right." Sophie nodded. A single dip of her chin, the same one she'd given him hours ago on the sidewalk. She lifted the glass of milk to her mouth and drank. Her hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped. The warmth of the diner and the food in her stomach had done their work. She looked different from the girl he'd found on the pavement. Still small, still thin, still wearing a face that had seen too much for its age. But the gray was gone from her lips and the light had come back into her eyes. Not a lot, just enough to prove it was still there. Then she said something that hit Garrett harder than any fist he'd ever taken. I tried to tell people. She said it quietly, factually, the way a child reports something that happened at school. No drama, no tears, no self-pity, just information. I went to the store, the one on the corner where Mama used to get bread. I told the lady at the counter that my mama was sick and she wouldn't get up. She said she'd call somebody, but nobody came. I went back the next day and she wasn't there. A different man was there and he told me to go home. She took another sip of milk, set the glass down with both hands. Then I went to the school, but it was closed. The doors were locked and nobody answered when I knocked. I stood there for a long time, but nobody came out. I could see the flag through the window, but nobody was inside. Lorraine had stopped wiping the counter. She stood motionless with the rag in her hand looking at the girl. Her jaw was set, but her chin was trembling. Then I knocked on Mr. Aldridge's door. He lives next to us. He has a dog. I thought maybe because he had a dog he would help, but he never answered. His truck was in the driveway, but he didn't come to the door. I knocked a lot of times. She paused, picked at the edge of Colt's jacket with her small fingers. I tried a lot. I tried every day, but nobody came. She wasn't crying when she said it. That was the part that destroyed something inside every person in that diner. She wasn't crying and she wasn't angry and she wasn't even sad. She was resigned. A 6-year-old girl sitting in a booth in a closed diner at 1 a.m, calmly listing every failed attempt she had made to save her own family, as if she were apologizing for not being better at it. As if the failure were hers, as if the responsibility for getting help had been placed on her shoulders, and she was reporting that she had done her best, but her best hadn't been good enough. Garrett looked at Lorraine. Lorraine looked down at the counter. Her hands were shaking. Colt, who had been sitting in the booth behind Sophie for the past 7 hours, had his head tilted back against the wall and his eyes closed. His jaw was working, moving side to side the way a man's jaw moves when he's holding something inside his mouth that he can't swallow and can't spit out. The diner was silent. The clock ticked. The grill had long since gone cold. The neon sign outside cast a faint pink glow through the front window that fell across Sophie's face and made her look like something out of a painting you'd see in a church. Garrett didn't speak for a long time. He sat across from this girl and he looked at her and he let the silence hold because there was nothing he could say that would be adequate. No words in any language he knew that could address what she had just told him. She had walked through a town full of adults carrying proof that her family was dying, and every single one of those adults had either looked away or said the words that people say when they don't want to get involved. I'll call someone. It's not my department. Go home. These were not bad people. He knew that. Every person who had turned Sophie away had probably gone to bed that night and slept fine because they had told themselves the story that all decent people tell themselves when they choose not to act. Someone else will handle it. It's probably not as bad as it seems. There are systems for this, agencies, numbers to call, professionals whose job it is to deal with these things. And those systems existed. Garrett knew that too. They existed on paper and in budgets and in the mission statements of organizations that had their names on the doors of buildings in the state capitol. But they didn't exist on Ash Street, not on a Tuesday in January, not for a 6-year-old girl with a broken zipper and no socks. Garrett leaned back in the booth. His leather creaked. He looked at the ceiling, and then he looked at Sophie, and then he looked at his own hands flat on the table. Big hands, scarred hands, hands that had done things he was not proud of, and things that existed in a gray area that he had stopped trying to sort out years ago. He remembered something, not all at once. It came to him the way memories come when you've spent a long time keeping them in a locked room. Slowly, reluctantly, like a door being pushed open against a piece of furniture that someone placed behind it to keep it shut. He was 7 years old, standing in his mother's kitchen in a house that wasn't much different from the one he'd just walked through on Ash Street. Same empty cabinets, same cold rooms, same feeling of something fundamental being absent. His mother was at the kitchen table. She had a cigarette in one hand and her forehead in the other, and she was looking at a stack of papers that Garrett later understood were bills. She looked up at him, and her face did something that he didn't have a word for at the time but would later recognize as the expression of a person who is about to ask their child to do something that no child should be asked to do. "Go over to Mrs. Harlan's house," she said. "Tell her you're just visiting. Tell her you came to see her cat. Stay for a while." He understood what she was telling him without her having to say it. Mrs. Harlan would feed him. Mrs. Harlan always had food in her kitchen, and she liked children, and she would never let a child sit at her table without putting something in front of him. His mother was sending him there because there was nothing in their own house to eat, and she didn't have the money to change that, and she didn't have the energy to explain why. He went. He told Mrs. Harlan he was just visiting. He played with her cat. She made him a ham sandwich and a glass of lemonade, and he ate it at her kitchen table while she talked about her garden. And he said the right things at the right times, and when he went home, his mother was still at the table with the cigarette and the papers, and she didn't ask him what he ate because she already knew. That was 36 years ago. And sitting in this booth in this diner at 1 a.m, looking at a 6-year-old girl who had done a version of the same thing he had done as a child, but on a scale that dwarfed anything he had experienced, Garrett understood something about himself that he had spent most of his adult life trying not to understand. He knew exactly what this felt like. He knew the taste of an empty kitchen. He knew the weight of a mother's failure when the failure wasn't her fault, but there was nobody else to blame, and a child doesn't understand systems and bureaucracies and employment statistics. A child understands one thing the person who is supposed to take care of me can't. Everything after that is survival. And every man in that chapter had a version of that story. That was the thing nobody outside the club understood, and nobody inside had ever talked about. These were not men who had grown up comfortable. They were not men who had been handed anything. Boone had been raised by a grandmother who cleaned hotel rooms 6 days a week and still couldn't keep the heat on in February. Colt had spent 3 years in the foster system before an uncle he barely knew took him in. Stump had been on his own since he was 16, sleeping in the back of a warehouse, until a foreman at a construction site offered him a job and a cot in the break room. Preacher had simply never mentioned his childhood to anyone, which was its own kind of answer. These were men who understood hunger, not as a metaphor, not as something they'd read about or seen on the news, as a physical memory stored in their bodies. The hollow feeling in the gut that starts around noon and gets worse by dinner and by morning has turned into something that lives behind your eyes and changes the way you see everything. They understood cold the same way, and loneliness, and the specific kind of shame that comes from being a child who knows his family is different from other families, and who learns very early to keep that knowledge hidden because hiding it is the only power he has. That's not why they did what they did tonight. Let that be clear. They didn't ride to Ash Street because of their own childhoods. They rode because a child needed help, and they were the ones who hurt her. But the reason they understood what they found when they got there, the reason they didn't flinch and didn't hesitate and didn't need anyone to explain what was happening inside that house, was because every one of them had stood in a version of that kitchen before. Every one of them had opened a refrigerator and found it empty. Every one of them knew what it sounded like when a house went quiet in the wrong way. He didn't say any of this out loud. He didn't tell Sophie about his mother, or Mrs. Harlan, or the ham sandwich, or the 36 years of distance between that kitchen and this one. He just sat there and looked at her, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than it should have been. "You did good, Sophie. You hear me? You did everything right." She looked at him. For the first time since he'd met her, something shifted in her face that might have been the beginning of a smile. It didn't quite get there. It stalled somewhere around the edges of her mouth and faded before it could take hold. But it had been there, and that was enough. Lorraine brought more coffee without being asked. She set a mug in front of Garrett and poured without looking at him and went back behind the counter and stood there with her back to the room for a full minute because she needed that minute and she was not going to apologize for taking it. Garrett pulled out his phone. He called Boone at the hospital. Boone picked up on the second ring. His voice was tired but steady. "Mother's stable. They've got her on IV fluids. Dehydrated. Malnourished. Kidney infection. Bad one been going untreated for weeks. They're admitting her. She'll be here at least 3 or 4 days. The baby with a mild hypothermia. They're holding him for observation, warming him up. The doc said another few hours in that house and it would have been different." Boone paused. The weight of what he was not saying filled the silence on the line. The way that little girl wrapped him up. The nurses keep talking about it. They said she probably saved his life, kept his core temperature just high enough. Garrett closed his eyes, opened them. "Stay with them. I don't want the mother waking up in a hospital room alone." "Not going anywhere." The line went dead. Garrett set the phone down on the table. Sophie had finished her milk, and her eyes were getting heavy again. The adrenaline that had kept her awake when he walked in had burned off, and her body was pulling her back down toward sleep. Colt reached across from his booth and took the empty glass from her hands before it could slip. The clock on the wall said 1:47 in the morning. Outside headlights swept across the front window of the diner. Not the wide beam of a motorcycle headlamp, the narrow piercing white of a police cruiser. The car pulled up to the curb. The light bar on top was dark, but the engine was running and the driver's door opened and a man got out. Sheriff Wade Haddix, 54 years old, 18 years wearing the badge of Braidwood County. He was not a large man, but he carried himself like one. Squared shoulders, rigid posture, a face that had settled into a permanent expression of mild suspicion, the face of a man who had spent 2 decades looking at people and deciding whether they were lying before they finished their first sentence. He pushed through the front door of the diner. The cold came in with him. His eyes went to Garrett first, then to Sophie asleep in the booth, then to Colt sitting behind her, then back to Garrett. "I got 3 calls in the last hour about a group of bikers going door to door on Ash Street," Haddix said. His voice was flat, professional, the voice of a man who was here in his official capacity and wanted everyone to know it. "People are concerned." Garrett looked at him. He didn't stand up. He didn't straighten in his seat. He didn't do any of the things that men normally do when a badge walks into a room. He just sat there, his hands flat on the table, and looked at the sheriff the way he looked at everything, directly, without apology. "People should have been concerned 6 weeks ago," Garrett said. "There's a woman in the hospital right now who hasn't eaten in a week. There's a baby in an incubator who was turning blue in a house with no heat. And this girl right here walked 8 blocks in 5 below, cold, because nobody in this town was paying attention. That's what people should be concerned about." Haddix's jaw tightened. He looked at Sophie, looked at the empty plate on the table, looked at the jacket draped over her that was worth more than anything in the house he'd never bothered to visit on the street he'd been paid to patrol. Something moved across his face. It might have been shame, it might have been anger, it might have been the thing that happens when a man who thinks of himself as responsible is confronted with evidence that he has been anything but. He stood in that doorway for a long time. The cold leaked in around him. The diner waited. Then he turned around and walked out. The door closed behind him. The cruiser's engine revved once and the headlights swept across the window, and he was gone. Lorraine locked the front door. She turned off the neon sign. The diner went dark except for the fluorescent tube in the back that she always left on. Sophie slept in the booth. Colt sat behind her with his back to the wall. Garrett sat across from her with his hands around a coffee mug that had gone cold an hour ago. Nobody spoke. The town outside was asleep. But on Ash Street, the fire in the barrel was still burning, and the people gathered around it were still standing, and the doors that had been closed for too long were finally for the first time open. The hours between 2 and 5 in the morning are the quietest hours in any small town. The streets empty. The traffic lights cycle through their colors for nobody. The buildings sit in darkness, and the cold settles into everything the way dust settles onto a shelf that nobody wipes. In those hours, Braidwood was as still as it had ever been. But the stillness was different now. It wasn't the stillness of a town that didn't know. It was the stillness of a town that was about to find out. The story moved through the dark the way stories move in small places. Not through the news, not through a broadcast or a headline or a push notification on a phone. It moved through phone calls, through one neighbor telling another at the gas station at 4 in the morning, through a night shift nurse at the hospital mentioning it to the orderly who was restocking the supply closet, through a cashier at the 24-hour gas station on Route 53 telling a trucker who told his wife, who told her sister, who lived 3 blocks from Main Street. By the time the sky began to lighten, the story of what had happened on Ash Street had reached every corner of Braidwood, and the town woke up different than it had gone to sleep. Morning came to Braidwood the way it always came in January, slowly, reluctantly, like the sun itself didn't want to face what the cold had done overnight. The sky turned from black to a deep iron gray around 6:30 and stayed that way. No warmth in it, no color, just a flat, heavy ceiling of cloud that pressed down on the town and held the cold in place like a lid on a pot. Lorraine opened the diner at 5 o'clock. She hadn't slept. She'd gone home around 3, sat on the edge of her bed for 40 minutes without taking off her shoes, and then got back in her car and drove to Main Street because she knew that whatever was coming today was going to start at her door, and she intended to be ready for it. She turned on every light in the place, fired up the grill, set the coffee going. Then she took a piece of cardboard from the supply closet, the stiff white kind that comes packed between stacks of paper plates, and she wrote on it with a black marker in letters large enough to read from the sidewalk. Free breakfast, Ash Street, families welcome. She taped it to the inside of the front window and stood back and looked at it. It wasn't pretty. The letters were uneven and the tape was crooked. But it said what it needed to say, and it said it clearly, and that was enough. Garrett arrived at 5:30. He'd been up all night. He sat in the booth where Sophie had slept, and Lorraine brought him coffee without asking, and he drank it black and didn't say much. He just sat there, watching the front door, watching the street outside through the window, the way a man watches when he's waiting for something to arrive, and he's not sure yet whether it's going to be good or bad. Boone called at 6:15. His voice was steady but tired. He'd been at the hospital since midnight. Mother's stable. IV fluids are working. They've got her on antibiotics for the kidney infection. She woke up twice during the night. Both times she asked about her kids. The baby, warming up. They said his temperature came up through the night. They're keeping him another day to be safe, but the doc says he's going to be fine. Garrett closed his eyes for a moment. Open them. Stay. I'm not going anywhere. By 7 o'clock, the first people started coming through the door, not from Ash Street, from the rest of town. The hardware store owner, a man named Driscoll, who had been on Main Street for 22 years and had never once been inside the bar, across the street, let alone spoken to the men who drank, there walked through the front door of Lorraine's carrying a box. He set it on the counter without ceremony. Inside were 6 brand new space heaters still in their packaging in a tangle of heavy-duty extension cords. For the families, he said. He looked at Lorraine. He did not look at Garrett. He couldn't. Not yet. Whatever he was feeling, and there was a lot of it moving behind his eyes, he wasn't ready to face the man in the booth who had done what he himself should have done months ago. He left the box and walked out. A woman from the pharmacy came next. 2 paper bags filled with over-the-counter medicine, children's vitamins, cough syrup, acetaminophen, a box of adhesive bandages, a tube of antibiotic ointment. She set the bags down beside the space heaters and said to Lorraine, I heard about last night. Is there a list of what they need? There will be, Lorraine said. Give me an hour. A teacher from Sophie's elementary school arrived at 7:30, carrying 3 backpacks stuffed with school supplies, granola bars, juice boxes, and small blankets. Her name was Mrs. Kellner, and she had taught first grade for 19 years. And she stood in the middle of that diner with tears running down her face and her hands shaking, and she said, "I had her in my class last fall. She missed 11 days in November and December. 11 days. And I filled out the paperwork and I sent it to the office and I assumed someone was following up." She paused. Her voice broke. Nobody followed up. Lorraine put a hand on her arm. Mrs. Kellner set the backpacks down and sat at the counter and drank coffee until her hands stopped shaking, and then she went to school and taught her class because that's what teachers do. They go to work even when the work has failed someone it was supposed to protect. By 8 o'clock, the counter at Lorraine's was stacked with donated goods, boxes and bays and bundles, enough to fill a truck. People kept coming. A retired plumber with a toolkit and an offer to fix anything that needed fixing on Ash Street. A woman from the church on Elm Street with 2 casserole dishes and a bag of rolls. A man in a business suit who dropped off an envelope with cash inside and left without giving his name. Every one of these people had been on Main Street the day before. Every single one of them had been within 100 yards of a 6-year-old girl sitting on a frozen sidewalk. And every single one of them had walked past her. But something about last night had changed the math. Something about seeing the men they feared most do the thing they themselves should have done. Something about hearing that 5 bikers in a closed diner had guarded a sleeping child while the rest of the town went home and turned on the heat and pretended everything was fine. That broke something open in Braidwood. Call it shame. Call it guilt. Call it the thing that happens when decent people are forced to look at the gap between who they think they are and what they actually did. Garrett sat in his booth and watched all of it. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He didn't look proud or satisfied or vindicated. He just watched. The way you watch a fire that you started on purpose to see if it would actually catch. He was making sure this was real. Making sure it wasn't just a morning of good intentions that would burn off by noon like fog. He didn't trust it yet. Maybe he never would. But he watched. Around 8:30, something happened that nobody had planned for. Ash Street families started arriving at the diner. Lorraine's sign had done its work. They came through the door one at a time or in pairs, cautious, uncertain. The way people move when they've been invited somewhere but aren't sure they belong. A young mother with a toddler on her hip and dark circles under her eyes. An older man with a cane who took 3 minutes to get from the door to the counter. A teenage boy, 15 or 16, wearing a hoodie that was too thin for the cold and shoes that were held together with duct tape at the sole. He came alone. He sat at the end of the counter and didn't say anything until Lorraine set a plate of eggs and sausage in front of him and said, "Eat." He ate everything, and then he sat there looking at the empty plate as if it might fill itself again. And Lorraine came back without being asked and set a second plate down, and he ate that too. Lorraine cooked for 3 straight hours. She didn't charge anyone. She didn't keep a tab. She didn't write anything down. Every plate came out of her own pocket, and by the end of the morning, she had served breakfast to 19 people and spent more than she usually made in a full Saturday lunch rush. She never mentioned the cost. Not then, not later, not to anyone. But it was what happened between the meals that mattered more than the food itself. People talked. Not about the weather or the news or the things that people normally talk about when they're sitting in a diner at 8 in the morning. They talked about real things, hard things. The woman with the toddler told Lorraine that she'd been sleeping in her car for 3 nights last month before a friend let her stay on a couch. The man with the cane said his Social Security check covered rent, but not food, and he'd been eating once a day since November. The teenage boy didn't talk at all, but when Mrs. Kellner came back during her lunch break and asked him his name, he said it quietly, and she wrote it down and called the school counselor before she'd finished her coffee. These were the people of Ash Street. They had been there all along. They had been hungry and cold and afraid and silent all along. They had not been invisible because they were hiding. They had been invisible because nobody was looking. The door opened again at 9:45, and the person who walked through it was not carrying donations. Her name was Nadine Prewitt, 47 years old, brown hair pulled back in a clip, dark blazer over a white blouse, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. She worked for the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services, and she had driven 40 minutes from the regional office in Belleville because a report had been filed overnight about 2 minor children found in conditions of severe neglect in a residence on Ash Street. She stopped inside the door and scanned the room. Her eyes were professional, assessing. They moved across the donated goods on the counter, the bikers in the booth, the sleeping child in Colt's jacket, and the massive man sitting across from her. She processed all of it in about 3 seconds, and then she walked to the counter and set her portfolio down and said to Lorraine, "I'm looking for the minor female found unaccompanied on Main Street yesterday afternoon. Sophie." Lorraine's hand stopped moving. She set down the coffee pot carefully, the way you set something down when your hands want to throw it instead. "She's right there," Lorraine said, "in the booth. She's been fed. She's been warm. She's been safe all night." Nadine nodded. She opened the portfolio and removed a form, a pen, a clipboard, the tools of a bureaucracy that was about to do what bureaucracies do when they arrive late to a crisis. They document, they assess, they open cases, they use language like placement and temporary custody and in the best interest of the child. And every one of those phrases, however well-intentioned, carries the weight of a system that is about to separate a family that has already been through more separation than any family should have to endure. "I'll need to conduct an assessment," Nadine said. "Given the conditions described in the report and the mother's current incapacity, the children may need to be placed in temporary protective custody while we evaluate the home environment and the mother's ability to provide adequate care." The diner went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a room at rest, the dangerous quiet of a room where something is about to happen that can't be taken back. Garrett stood up. Slowly, the booth creaked. Every eye in the diner was on him. Nadine Prewitt looked up from her clipboard, and for the first time something other than professional composure crossed her face. She was looking at 6 feet 4 inches and 260 pounds of leather and scar tissue, and barely controlled anger and whatever training she'd received for difficult field interactions. This was probably not the scenario they'd used in the workshop. "Sit down," Lorraine said, not to Nadine, to Garrett. He looked at her. "Sit down," she said again. Quieter, firmer. "This isn't the way." Garrett stood there for a long moment. The muscles in his jaw were working. His hands hanging at his sides had curled into fists that were dense and white at the knuckles. Then he exhaled, a long, controlled breath that carried something out of him that would have made the next 5 minutes very different if he'd kept it in. He sat down. Lorraine came around the counter. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood in front of Nadine Prewitt, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and calm and carried the authority of a woman who had fed this town for 31 years and was not about to let it fail one more time. "Let me tell you what happened last night," she said, "because I don't think your report has the whole picture." She told it, all of it, from the moment Garrett knocked on her door to the moment the last biker left Ash Street. She told it clearly and without embellishment and without tears, though the effort of that restraint was visible in the tightness around her eyes. She told Nadine about the note in the jacket, about the mother on the mattress, about the baby in the crib, about the way Sophie had wrapped her brother in every piece of cloth she could find, about the neighbors opening their doors, about the 7 families, about the fire in the barrel, and the old man who asked who sent them. When she finished, the diner was silent. Nadine Prewitt looked at her clipboard. Then she looked at Sophie, still asleep in the booth, her small hand curled around the collar of a leather jacket that was 12 times her weight. Then she looked back at Lorraine. The conditions described constitute a prima facie case of child endangerment, she said, but her voice had changed. The professional edge had softened. Not much, just enough. I have an obligation to evaluate placement options. No, said a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned. Sheriff Wade Haddock stood on the threshold. He must have come in while Lorraine was talking. He was in uniform, badge on his chest, hat in his hand. His face looked different from last night. The rigid composure was gone. In its place was something raw or less defended. The face of a man who had been up all night doing the kind of thinking that happens when you can't lie to yourself anymore. I spoke to the hospital this morning, Haddock said. He walked into the room and stood beside Lorraine, not behind her, beside her. The mother is coherent. She's cooperating. The doctor says she'll be discharged within the week. She didn't neglect those children, Mrs. Prewitt. She was sick, critically ill, in a house with no heat and no phone. She couldn't get to a door, let alone a phone booth. He paused, looked at Nadine. His voice dropped. And I'll tell you something else. I patrol that street. Ash Street is in my jurisdiction. I drive past it twice a shift. And I missed this. I missed all of it. A woman dying in her own bed, 2 children in a house with no food. I missed it because I wasn't looking. So before we start talking about who failed these kids, maybe we should start with the people who were paid to look and didn't. Mrs. Kellner, the teacher, had come back. She stood near the door with her coat still on. I'll vouch for the mother, she said. I've met her twice at school events. She's attentive. She cares about Sophie's education. This wasn't neglect. This was a crisis. Driscoll, the hardware store owner, spoke up from the back of the room. I've got 6 heaters and a crew heading to that house today. It'll be warm and livable by tonight. The retired plumber raised his hand. Pipes are fixed. Water's running. I checked this morning. One by one, the people who had failed and who knew they had failed and who were now trying to make it right stood up and put themselves between Nadine Prewitt's clipboard and Sophie's future. Not because they were heroes, because they were ashamed. And shame, when it's real and when it lands in the right place, can be the most powerful force in a room. Nadine Prewitt looked at the faces around her. She looked at her forms. She looked at the clipboard that held the weight of a system that was designed to protect children, but that sometimes in its mechanical efficiency did the opposite. She closed the portfolio. I'll file a monitoring report, she said. We'll do home visits weekly until the mother is fully recovered and the home meets standard. But I won't initiate removal proceedings today. The room exhaled. Sophie stirred in the booth. She opened her eyes slowly, the way children do when they wake up in an unfamiliar place and need a moment to remember where they are. She looked around the diner, at the faces, at the bags and box on the counter, at Garrett in the booth across from her. Where's Mama? She said. Garrett leaned forward. She's getting better. The doctors are helping her. She's going to come home. When? Soon. Can I see her today? I'll make sure of it. Sophie looked at him for a long time. She was 6 years old and she had the eyes of someone who had learned very young that promises made by adults do not always become true. But something in Garrett's voice or in his face, or in the fact that he had done every single thing he said he would do since the moment he crossed that street, made her believe him. She nodded. Boone drove Sophie to the hospital that afternoon. Garrett rode alongside on his Harley. The ride took 12 minutes. Sophie sat in the passenger seat of Boone's truck, the seatbelt crossed over the leather jacket she was still wearing because she hadn't taken it off since Colt had draped it over her shoulders, and she hadn't asked if she could keep it, and nobody had asked her to give it back. She sat with her hands in her lap and watched the town go past through the window and didn't say a word. Boone drove carefully slower than he'd ever driven anything in his life because the cargo in that passenger seat was more valuable than anything he'd ever hauled, and he understood that in his bones. When they arrived at the hospital, Sophie walked down the corridor with the kind of focused determination that you see in much older people. She didn't look at the rooms on either side. didn't look at the nurses or the monitors or the fluorescent lights. She just walked, straight ahead, toward the room number that Boone had told her. Third door on the left. She stopped in the doorway. Jolene was sitting up in the bed. An IV line ran into her left arm. A heart monitor beeped steadily beside her. Her face was thin and pale, and the bones in her wrist showed through the hospital gown the way they had shown through the blanket on that mattress. But her eyes were different. They were clear, focused, present. The fog was gone. The drift was gone. She was here, fully here. When she saw Sophie in the doorway, something happened to Jolene's face that no language has a word for. It didn't crumble. It didn't break. It opened. Every defense, every wall, every layer of guilt and exhaustion and terror that she had been holding behind her expression for weeks fell away at once, and what was left was the rawest, most unprotected thing a human face can produce. A mother seeing her child alive and safe after lying in the dark for 4 days believing she might never see her again. Sophie. That was all she said. One word. Her daughter's name. And the way she said it carried every prayer she'd whispered into that cold ceiling during those 4 days when she couldn't move and couldn't call and couldn't do anything except lie there and hope that her children were still alive. Sophie ran to her. Her feet barely made a sound on the hospital floor. She crossed the room in 4 quick steps and threw herself against her mother's chest, and Jolene's arms came around her and closed and held and tightened, and neither one of them said another word for a very long time. The heart monitor beeped. The IV dripped. A nurse passed in the hallway and glanced in and kept walking, because what was happening in that room didn't need interference and didn't need documentation and didn't need anything except time. Wyatt was in a bassinet on the other side of the bed. He was awake. His eyes were open and tracking the ceiling lights, and his color was good. Pink where it should be pink. Warm where it should be warm. When Sophie finally lifted her head from her mother's chest, she looked at the bassinet and said, "Can I hold him?" Jolene nodded. A nurse helped adjust the bed so Jolene could sit up straighter, and Boone, who had been standing near the door with his hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had absolutely no idea what to do with himself, in a hospital room, stepped forward and lifted Wyatt from the bassinet with a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who knew him only by his leather and his reputation. He placed the baby in Sophie's arms, and she held him the way she'd been holding him for weeks, carefully, firmly, like she was the only thing between him and the cold. Garrett stood in the hallway. He didn't enter the room. This was not his moment, and he knew it with the same certainty that he knew which side of a fight to stand on and when to swing and when to hold. He watched from the corridor, and his face showed nothing, because that's what his face was built to show. But his hands hanging at his sides uncurled for the first time since he'd sat down in that diner booth 9 hours ago. Whatever tension had been locked inside them finally released. When Sophie lifted her head from her mother's shoulder and looked over at the doorway and found his face, he gave her a nod. Just one. The smallest movement a human head can make and still be called agreement. Then he turned around and walked down the hallway and out of the hospital, and he did not look back. Jolene spent 4 days in the hospital, severe dehydration, malnutrition, a kidney infection that had gone untreated for weeks because she couldn't afford the refill on her prescription, and she couldn't get out of bed to get to a pharmacy, and she couldn't make a phone call because her phone had been shut off 6 days before the infection got bad. The doctor said later that another 24 hours and the infection would have reached her bloodstream. Sepsis. At that point, the survival rate drops to a coin flip. They told Jolene this when she was strong enough to hear it. She didn't react. She just looked at the ceiling for a long time, and then she asked if Sophie had eaten today, and the nurse said yes, and Jolene closed her eyes, and that was the end of that conversation. Jolene was 31 years old. She had been a good mother. That needs to be said clearly and without qualification, because the paperwork and the reports in the clipboard language of the system she was about to enter would suggest otherwise. She had been a good mother who made sure her children ate before she did, who walked Sophie to school every morning and picked her up every afternoon, who read to Wyatt every night from a board book she'd found at a yard sale, who kept the house clean and the bills paid and the appointments scheduled and the whole fragile architecture of a single-parent household standing upright through sheer force of will. She had been doing it alone for 2 years since Sophie's father left and didn't come back, and she had been doing it well. Then the plant closed. She had worked at a packaging facility 12 miles north of town. Decent pay, health insurance, a schedule that let her drop Sophie off at school before her shift and pick her up after. It was the kind of job that doesn't make anyone rich, but keeps the gears turning, keeps the rent paid, keeps the lights on, keeps a family moving forward instead of standing still. She was one of 14 workers let go on the same day, a Wednesday. The manager called them into a room and told them the facility was being consolidated. He used the word restructured. He said it 3 times. The last paycheck would be deposited on Friday. They could apply for COBRA to continue their health insurance at full cost, which was $900 a month, which was more than half her take-home pay. She'd filed for unemployment the next morning, sat on hold for 2 hours, got transferred to a different department, sat on hold again. Filled out forms online that required documents she didn't have copies of because her printer was broken and the library was only open 3 days a week and the closest copy shop was 14 miles away. Called back, got disconnected, called again, got a voicemail, left a message, never got a call back. She'd applied for food assistance, for utility assistance, for emergency rental aid. Every program had a different application. Every application required different paperwork. Every office had different hours and different requirements and a different voice on the phone that said the same thing in a different way. We'll process your application within 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks. When your last paycheck has already been spent and your kitchen is already empty and your daughter is already asking why there's nothing for breakfast. 4 to 6 weeks is not a timeline. It's a death sentence delivered politely. She'd spent weeks trying to navigate a system that was theoretically designed to help people like her, but that in practice moved at the speed of a glacier while her family was falling at the speed of gravity. She filled out every form. She made every call. She drove to every office that she could reach with the kiss she had left. She did everything right, and none of it was fast enough. By the time the infection took hold and she couldn't stand, she had no phone credit, no car, no energy, and no one to call even if she'd had all 3. She told Sophie to stay inside, stay warm, don't leave, take care of Wyatt. She said these things and then she closed her eyes and she didn't open them again for a long time. But Sophie was 6, and 6-year-olds don't obey instructions that don't make sense to them. When your mother's eyes won't open and your baby brother is crying and the house is cold and there's nothing in the kitchen, staying inside is not an option that a 6-year-old can accept. So she did what made sense to her. She wrote a note. She gathered the papers that seemed important. She stuffed them into her jacket and she walked out the door. She walked to the store. She walked to the school. She knocked on the neighbor's door. She tried everything she could think of and none of it worked. And she went home each time and checked on Wyatt and adjusted the cloth she'd wrapped around him and sat beside his crib and talked to him in a quiet voice because she had heard somewhere that babies need to hear voices and she was the only voice he had. And then she walked out one more time into 5 below cold onto Main Street, and she fell on the sidewalk and said 2 words, and a man heard her. Baby Wyatt was discharged on the 3rd day. The nurses said his core temperature had stabilized within 6 hours of arrival. They said the improvised insulation that Sophie had created around him, the layered t-shirts and dish towels and pillowcase and fleece blanket, had been remarkably effective. Not professional, not textbook, but effective. A few more hours in that house, and the outcome would have been different. Nobody said that part out loud in front of Sophie, but everyone who heard it understood exactly what it meant. An 8-month-old baby was alive because his 6-year-old sister had wrapped him in everything soft she could find and then walked into the worst cold of the year to find help. The town took care of the family after that. Not the bikers. The town. A local civic group organized a fund that covered 3 months of rent and utility payments. The church on Elm Street donated furniture. A bed frame and mattress for Jolene's room, a real one, not a bare pad on the floor. A dresser, a kitchen table with 4 chairs, a couch that didn't sag in the middle. Small things that most people never think about because they've always had them. But for Jolene, walking into that house after 4 days in the hospital and seeing a kitchen table with chairs around it was almost more than she could take. She stood in the doorway of her own kitchen with Wyatt on her hip and Sophie holding her hand, and she looked at that table and the tears came, and she didn't try to stop them. She just stood there and let them fall. Lorraine's Diner became the unofficial collection point for donations, and within a week, the corner of the counter that had been stacked with boxes on that first morning had become a permanent station. People dropped things off every day. Clothes, shoes, canned goods, diapers, a car seat barely used from a family whose children had outgrown it, a winter coat for Sophie the right size this time, with a zipper that worked and a hood lined with fleece. Sophie tried it on in the diner and zipped it all the way up to her chin, and Lorraine had to turn away because watching a child be happy about a coat that fits is the kind of thing that can break a person who has been holding it together for too long. The school connected Jolene with a job placement program. A neighbor, the same woman who had walked over to the chain link fence that first night and admitted her own children hadn't eaten, volunteered to watch Wyatt during the day while Jolene rebuilt. The system that had failed them, the agencies and the offices and the phone lines that had let a family fall through every crack in the floor, finally started doing what it was supposed to do. But it took 22 bikers in leather to embarrass it into motion. Nadine Prewitt came back every Wednesday for 6 weeks. She inspected the house. She checked the kitchen. She opened the refrigerator and looked inside and wrote something on her clipboard. She walked through every room. She talked to Jolene and to Sophie, and once she sat on the living room floor and played with Wyatt for 10 minutes while she observed his motor skills and his response to stimulation, and wrote notes that would go into a file in a building 40 minutes away. Every Wednesday, the house was warm. The kitchen was stocked. The lights were on. Wyatt was healthy and gaining weight. Sophie was going to school every day wearing the coat that zipped all the way up, carrying a backpack that had been donated by Mrs. Kellner. And Jolene was getting stronger. She'd started the job placement program. She was making calls. She was keeping appointments. She was rebuilding the architecture that had collapsed one brick at a time, the way people rebuild after any disaster. Not fast, not easy, but steady. On the 7th visit, Nadine closed the case. She sat at the kitchen table with Jolene and went through the paperwork one final time and signed the last form and placed it in her portfolio. Then she did something that surprised Jolene. She reached across the table and took her hand. "I've been doing this work for 22 years, Nadine said. "I've seen a lot of homes, a lot of families. What I see here is a mother who fought for her kids with everything she had and a system that let her down. I'm sorry it took this long for someone to notice." She stood up and walked to the front door. She stopped on the porch and looked at the house and she said, "You've got good people around you." And Jolene, standing in the doorway with Wyatt on her hip and Sophie at her side, said, I know. Garrett never did interviews. Not one. When a reporter from the Braidwood Register called the clubhouse looking for a comment, whoever answered the phone said, "Wrong number," and hung up. When a television crew from a station in Springfield drove out to get footage, they found an empty parking lot and a closed door and a handwritten note that said nothing except no. The bikers had no interest in being a story. They had done what they did, and that was the end of their involvement in the narrative. What happened next belonged to the town and to the family and to the people who had woken up that morning and realized that they had been asleep for a very long time. But Lorraine talked. She told the paper everything. How Garrett stood at her door in the cold and pointed at a child on the sidewalk. How 5 men in leather sat in her diner like they were guarding a fortress. How they rode to Ash Street and did in one night what the rest of the town hadn't done in months. And she said one thing that ended up on the front page. I've lived in this town my whole life. I've served breakfast to every kind of person who walks through that door. And the men I was most afraid of turned out to be the only ones who gave a damn. A few weeks after everything settled, Lorraine put a photograph behind the counter. Someone had taken it that first night with a cheap cell phone camera. The quality was poor, the lighting was wrong, but the image was clear. Sophie asleep in the booth, Colt's leather jacket pulled up to her chin, one small hand gripping the collar, her face still and peaceful for the first time in weeks. The light from the neon sign in the window came through the glass at an angle and fell across her cheek and gave her skin a soft, warm glow that looked like it belonged in a painting, not a photograph. Lorraine had it printed and framed in a simple black frame. She hung it on the wall behind the register, right where every customer could see it when they paid their bill. She never took it down, and nobody ever asked her to. Lorraine kept the Ash Street family's welcome sign in the window for 3 months. Then she took it down and replaced it with nothing, because by that point the sign was unnecessary. The families came anyway. They came for breakfast, and they came for coffee, and they came because Lorraine's had become the place where people from both sides of the railroad tracks sat at the same counter and ate the same eggs, and nobody cared which street you lived on. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. Nobody made speeches about it. The town didn't hold a ceremony or pass a resolution. It was quieter than that. It was a woman from Ash Street sitting next to the hardware store owner at 7 in the morning, and both of them nodding at each other and neither of them finding that strange. It was the retired plumber who had fixed Jolene's pipes showing up every Saturday to check on the houses on the block. Not because anyone asked him to, because he had seen what happens when nobody checks. Jolene got a job. It took 6 weeks. The placement program connected her with a warehouse distribution center 20 minutes outside of town. It wasn't what she'd had before. The hours were longer and the drive was farther and the pay was less. But it was a paycheck. And a paycheck meant rent and utilities and food and the prescription refill that she would never let run out again. She paid back every dollar of the fund that had covered her rent. It took her 8 months. She walked into the civic group's office with an envelope of cash and handed it over and said, "For the next family." The woman behind the desk tried to tell her that it was a gift, that she didn't owe anything, that the money was meant to be given, not repaid. Jolene set the envelope on the desk and walked out. She didn't argue about it. She had made her decision, and that was that. Sheriff Haddix changed his patrol route. He added Ash Street to his regular rounds. He drove it slowly twice a shift, the way he should have been doing all along. He didn't talk about it. He didn't make a public statement. He just did it. And when a porch light went out on that block, the city replaced it within 48 hours. That was Haddix too. Nobody proved it, and he never admitted it. But the light stayed on. There's one thing about this story that stays after everything else fades. It's not that Garrett was a good man. Maybe he was. Maybe he wasn't. He had a record and a scar and a history that would make most people uncomfortable. He wasn't a hero out of a movie, and he would have been the first to say so and the angriest if someone had called him one. He didn't do what he did because he was good. He did it because he heard a voice and he moved. That's the whole thing. That's the entire mechanism. He heard a voice and he moved. He didn't stop to evaluate whether it was his responsibility. He didn't wait to see if someone more qualified would handle it. He didn't weigh the risks or calculate the optics or wonder what it would look like for a man with his reputation to be seen carrying a child into a closed diner on a Tuesday afternoon. He just got off his bike, crossed the street, and did something. And by doing that, by doing the simplest possible version of what any human being should do when a child is in trouble, he showed an entire town what they had been failing at. Not because they were bad people, they weren't. Every person who walked past Sophie that afternoon was a decent, tax-paying, law-abiding citizen of Braidwood, Illinois. They went home that night and made dinner and turned on the heat and tucked their own children into warm beds. They were good people, but good people who keep walking when a child is hungry on a frozen sidewalk. That was the math, and the answer it produced was zero. The bikers didn't save that town. Let's be clear about that. Sophie saved it. A 6-year-old girl with a broken zipper and no socks saved an entire town from the lie it had been telling itself for years. The lie that someone else would handle it. The lie that there were systems in place. The lie that people who needed help would find it because that's what this country was built to do. Sophie found help, but she didn't find it where she was supposed to. She didn't find it at the store or the school or the neighbor's house. She found it sitting on a Harley-Davidson across the street from a bar, wrapped in leather and tattoos, and a reputation that made the whole town look the other way. She found the one group of people in Braidwood who didn't know how to walk past something that was broken without stopping to see if they could fix it. 2 words in a walk that should have killed her. That's what it took. That's what it carries. An 8-block march through the worst cold of the year on bare feet and canvas shoes, carrying a note in her jacket that said everything and that nobody had been willing to read. She laid it all on the line, every ounce of strength in her 40-pound body, and she bet everything on the chance that someone on Main Street would hear her. One person did. Sophie is older now, and from what people in town say, she remembers that night with a clarity that most adults don't have about events from their childhood. She doesn't remember the cold. She doesn't remember the hunger. She doesn't remember falling on the sidewalk or the gray of the sky or the faces of the people who walk past her. She remembers the rumble, that low, heavy, unmistakable sound of motorcycle engines turning over on a cold street. She remembers it the way some people remember a church bell or a train whistle or the sound of their mother's voice calling them home. It was the sound that meant someone was coming. It was the sound that meant help had arrived. She remembers a big man with a rough voice and a scar on his neck who sat across from her in a diner booth and told her to eat slow. Who said those words not as an instruction, but as a promise it's not going anywhere. Take your time. The food will be here when you need it. That voice is still in her memory the way certain voices stay. Not loud, not soft, just present. Steady, unmovable, and she remembers falling asleep in a jacket that smelled like leather and motor oil and road dust. She remembers the weight of it on her shoulders. She remembers pulling it tight around herself and feeling for the first time in weeks like someone was standing watch, like someone was sitting between her and the door and nothing bad was going to come through that door because the person sitting there wouldn't allow it. That's what she remembers. Not the worst of it, the best. The moment when the worst was over and something else had taken its place. Something warm and heavy and real. That's the whole story. A little girl said 2 words on a frozen sidewalk. A man on a motorcycle heard them. And on one night on one street in one small town that had spent years looking the other way, the people everyone was afraid of turned out to be the only ones willing to care.